Hey friends! Glad you're here at No Harry, we've cooked up something special. What if Gringotts found Harry owned 200 properties Dumbledore secretly rented for 10 years and demanded trial? Liking and subscribing really helps us out. Okay, story time. Chapter 1, The Audit. The letter arrived at 6 in the morning. Not Hagrid. Not the motorcycle. Not the thunderous knock on the door that Harry had been half expecting ever since he'd found the first envelope tucked into the mail slot 3 days ago, before Uncle Vernon had snatched it away with a face the color of a ripe tomato. This was different. Harry was already awake. He was always awake early, because the cupboard under the stairs didn't exactly encourage sleeping in, when he heard the sound. Not a knock. A tap. Precise, deliberate, 3 times against the small vent window above his cot that Uncle Vernon had never bothered to board up because it was too small for anything useful to get through. Except, apparently, for a small grey owl the size of a fist, wearing a leather satchel stamped with a crest Harry didn't recognize. Gold and black, with a key crossed over a pickaxe. Harry stared at it. The owl stared back with the particular expression of a creature that has a job to do and would very much like to get on with it. Harry unlatched the vent. The owl dropped the satchel onto his lap with professional efficiency, refused the piece of stale bread Harry offered it, and left. No waiting for a reply. Whatever this was, it didn't require one. The satchel contained a single envelope, cream-colored and heavy, sealed with wax pressed into the same crest as the owl's satchel. Printed across the front in ink that seemed to shift between gold and black depending on the angle, Master Harold James Potter, heir to the ancient and noble house of Potter, Vault 687, primary inheritance. This correspondence is magically binding and legally privileged under the Goblin Accord of 1478. Interference by any non-addressee constitutes a breach of contract punishable under both Goblin and Wizarding law. Harry read that last line twice. Then he tucked the satchel under his thin mattress, got dressed in the quietest clothes he owned, and waited. By 7, the Dursleys were moving. By 7:30, Aunt Petunia was making breakfast and Dudley was thundering down the stairs demanding to know why there weren't enough sausages. By 8, Harry had slipped out the back door with the satchel under his arm and was walking toward the bus stop at the end of Privet Drive. He'd had the letter for 3 days, the Hogwarts one, the one Vernon had nearly shredded before Harry had pawned a copy during the chaos of the second delivery. He'd read it so many times the creases were soft as cloth. He knew what the leaky cauldron was. He knew what Diagon Alley was. He'd spent 3 days in his cupboard reading everything he'd been able to find in the Dursley household about London, about banks, about what you did when you received formal legal correspondence. The answer, as far as Harry could tell, was that you showed up. He was 11 years old. He had £2.40 in his pocket, which was enough for the bus into central London. He had no idea what a Gringotts goblin looked like, or whether they'd take him seriously, or whether he was about to make an enormous mistake. He got on the bus anyway. The letter, once he opened it in his seat at the back of the near-empty bus, was 4 pages long. The first page was a formal heading that made his eyes water with its density of legal terminology. The second page was a summary, and the summary was where Harry's stomach dropped somewhere below the bus floor and kept falling. Dear Master Potter, Gringotts Wizarding Bank hereby notifies you that in accordance with the inheritance protocols governing accounts held by ancient and noble houses, an automatic audit of all Potter family assets was triggered upon your 11th birthday, the 31st of July, 1991. The audit has identified significant irregularities in the management of Potter family properties. Specifically, 212 properties belonging to the ancient and noble house of Potter, held in trust pending your majority, have been leased to third parties over a period of 10 years without the knowledge or documented consent of the Potter estate's heir or any Gringotts appointed trustee. The leases were arranged and the rental income collected by one Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, who claimed authority as your magical guardian in documentation submitted to Gringotts in 1981. Total income collected and not deposited to Potter accounts over the period of 10 years amounts to approximately 450,000 galleons. Gringotts has filed a formal demand for magical trial under the Goblin Accord of 1478 and the Wizarding Properties Act of 1692. A representative of the Potter estate is required to present themselves at Gringotts, London, at their earliest convenience to review the full audit report and authorize legal proceedings. We remain, as always, at the service of the Potter family. Ragnarok, Senior Account Manager, Gringotts Wizarding Bank, London. Harry read it once. Then again. Then a third time, pressing each word flat in his mind the way he'd learned to process information when the thing it was telling you was so large that your brain kept sliding off it. 450,000 galleons. He didn't know what a galleon was worth. But the word 100,000 was doing something very particular to his heartbeat. 212 properties. He didn't own anything. He'd never owned anything. He slept in a cupboard. His clothes were Dudley's hand-me-downs. He'd never had a birthday cake. He'd never had more than £2 in his pocket at once. 10 years. Since 1981. Since his parents died. The bus rolled into central London and Harry sat very still, watching the city slide past the window, and felt something settle in his chest that he didn't have a name for yet. It wasn't anger, exactly. It was colder than anger. More patient. He found the leaky cauldron the way the letter had described it, in a cramped space between a bookshop and a record store that his eyes kept trying to skip over. He pushed through the door, walked straight through the dim pub, a few patrons stared at his forehead, which was annoying, tapped the brick sequence he'd memorized from the Hogwarts letters enclosed pamphlet, and walked into Diagon Alley for the first time. He gave himself exactly 30 seconds to be overwhelmed by it. 30 seconds of looking at the crooked buildings, the robe shops, the cauldron display, the owl emporium, the smell of something that was either magical bread or magical smoke, the people in robes and pointed hats moving with the casual ease of people who had never once had to pretend this wasn't real. Then he walked to the white marble building at the end of the alley and climbed the stairs. The goblin at the front desk looked at him with an expression that suggested it had seen 11-year-old humans before and was not particularly impressed by the category. "I have an appointment," Harry said. "Harry Potter, here to see Ragnarok." The goblin's expression didn't change, but something in its eyes sharpened. "Identification." Harry set the letter on the desk. The goblin touched it once, and the wax crest flared gold. "This way." He was led through corridors that grew progressively less decorative and more functional, no gilded portraits, no chandeliers, just stone and torchlight and the distant sound of carts rattling through tunnels far below. The goblin stopped outside a door of dark wood, knocked twice, and left without a word. "Enter," said a voice from inside. Ragnarok was old. Not old the way Dumbledore was old, with white hair and a grandfatherly stoop that made him seem soft. Ragnarok was old the way stone was old, dense, settled, carrying the memory of enormous pressure. He sat behind a desk covered in scrolls, ledgers, and what appeared to be a small scale that was weighing nothing visible, though its pans kept adjusting as if they were. He looked at Harry for a long moment. "You came alone," he said. "Yes." "No guardian. No adult wizard." "No." Ragnarok's expression didn't shift exactly, but something in the quality of his stillness changed. "Sit down, Master Potter." Harry sat. The chair was slightly too large for him, which he suspected was the usual situation, so he sat forward on it instead of sinking back, which at least made him feel less like a child in the headmaster's office. "You've read the letter," Ragnarok said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. 3 times. And your first instinct was to come here alone, without consulting any adult wizard." "My first instinct," Harry said, "was to figure out whether any adult wizard I could consult was part of the problem." Ragnarok was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up the nearest ledger, opened it to a marked page, and turned it to face Harry. "The full audit report. You are entitled to review every line. I would suggest beginning on page 4, where the property documentation begins, and page 37, where the financial summary is." Harry pulled the ledger toward him and started reading. He was not a fast reader, years of getting by with minimal tutoring had left gaps, but he was a careful one. He worked through the property listings in silence, building a picture that was so much larger than the letter had suggested that by page 20 he'd stopped being surprised by individual entries and started looking at the shape of the whole thing. The properties weren't random. That was the first thing. They were spread across Britain and Europe, yes, but they weren't scattered. There were clusters, 6 properties in Edinburgh, 11 in Bristol, 8 in Paris, a whole complex of properties in the Lake District that the ledger described as agricultural holdings, currently leased to one consortium managing several farms. The rents weren't random either. They were set just low enough to seem reasonable if you were looking at any individual lease, but the cumulative total, extracted from the estate over 10 years, was breathtaking. And the money went into accounts Harry had never heard of. Where did it go? He asked, not looking up from the ledger. That is the question we are legally obligated to investigate, Ragnock said. Gringotts is not the ministry. We do not speculate in official documents. What we can tell you is that the funds were transferred through a series of intermediary accounts, some held at Gringotts under organizational names, some held at financial institutions in non-magical jurisdictions, and that tracing the complete chain will require authorization from the Ministry's Magical Law Enforcement Division, which is part of why we have filed for a formal demand rather than simply issuing an administrative complaint. A formal demand, Harry said. What does that actually mean? For him. Ragnock folded his hands on the desk. Under the Goblin Accord of 1478, which predates the Ministry of Magic and supersedes it in matters of property law, a formal demand triggers a mandatory Wisengamot hearing that cannot be postponed, cancelled, or otherwise obstructed by any party, including the chief warlock of the Wisengamot. Harry looked up. Who is currently Albus Dumbledore? Yes. And he can't stop his own trial? He cannot chair it, Ragnock said. Under the Accord, when the named party holds a position that creates a conflict of interest with the legal body, an independent presiding officer is appointed by Gringotts. In this case, we have already nominated Madame Amelia Bones, head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, subject to your approval as the injured party. Harry thought about that for a moment. He'd never heard of Amelia Bones. But she was head of law enforcement, which meant she was at least theoretically separate from Dumbledore's orbit. She's not connected to him. Not a friend, a follower, someone who owes him a favor. Madame Bones is known for her independence, Ragnock said. She prosecuted 3 members of Dumbledore's own Order of the Phoenix for war crimes in 1981 and did not back down when he personally requested leniency. She is not a woman who is moved by personal loyalty when the law is clear. Then yes, Harry said. I approve. He closed the ledger. The room was quiet except for the soft adjustment of the scales pans. I have to ask you something, Harry said, and I want an honest answer, not a diplomatic one. Ragnock waited. Why did this take 10 years? You're a bank. You manage these accounts. You've been watching someone drain money out of them for a decade. Why is it only now, on my birthday, that anyone noticed? It was a sharp question, and he knew it. He wasn't accusing Ragnock personally. The letter had been the first communication he'd ever received from Gringotts, which suggested the bank hadn't been in the habit of informing him of things, but he wanted to see how the goblin handled it. Ragnock was quiet for long enough that Harry thought he might not answer. Then, the properties are held in a trust that activates on your 11th birthday. Before that date, the management authority delegated to your magical guardian was technically valid under wizarding law, though not under the Goblin Accord. Gringotts enforces the Accord, but we do not enforce wizarding law, that is the Ministry's responsibility. The Ministry, for reasons that may become clearer during the trial, appears not to have noticed. Or chose not to, Harry said. Ragnock's eyes held something that in a human face would have been respect. That determination will be for the trial to establish. Harry nodded slowly. He looked down at the ledger again, not reading it now, just giving himself something to look at while his thoughts arranged themselves into order. 212 properties. 10 years. 450,000 galleons. And all of it while Harry Potter had been sleeping in a cupboard, not knowing he had a vault in this building, not knowing what a galleon was, not knowing that his parents had left him something that made him, apparently, one of the wealthiest people in Wizarding Britain. "I want to see my vault," he said. Ragnarok rose from his chair without ceremony. Of course. The cart ride was, objectively, extraordinary, the rush of underground air, the glimpses of other vaults in the flashing torchlight, the dizzying drops and turns, and Harry would have found it thrilling on any other day. Today he sat quietly and thought about his parents, who had left him all of this, and about the man who had spent a decade taking it. Vault 687 was not the first vault they passed, nor the deepest, but when the door opened and the torchlight spilled across the interior, Harry understood for the first time in his life what it meant to come from somewhere. The gold was almost secondary. It was the other things, the shelves of documents, the framed family crest on the back wall, the sealed chest in the corner labeled James and Lily Potter, personal effects, held in trust, that made his chest do something complicated and painful. He stood in the doorway for a moment looking at it. Then he walked in. "The chest," he said. "I can take that today." "Everything in this vault is yours," Ragnarok said, standing outside with the cart operator. "Today, on your birthday, all access restrictions lift." Harry put his hand on the chest. It was the size of a large shoebox, made of dark wood, and it hummed faintly when he touched it, not a mechanical hum, something warmer than that. He picked it up. It was heavier than it looked. He took a reasonable amount of gold, Ragnarok's assistant had provided a conversion chart on the ride down, and he took enough to cover school supplies, an emergency reserve, and what he privately thought of as just-in-case money, and then he went back up. In Ragnarok's office, they spent another 2 hours going over the formal authorization documents. Harry signed where he was told to sign, asked about everything he didn't understand, and refused to sign anything he couldn't parse completely. Ragnarok answered every question with the same flat directness he'd shown from the start, and Harry found he liked him for it. "When is the trial?" Harry asked, as they were finishing. "The Goblin Accord requires the hearing be convened within 60 days of the filing. Given the political sensitivity of the parties involved, I expect Madam Bones will push for sooner rather than later. The longer the delay, the more opportunity for interference. I would expect a date in September, which means shortly after you begin at Hogwarts." "At Hogwarts," Harry said. "Where Dumbledore is headmaster?" "Yes." Harry looked at the stack of signed documents on the desk between them. "Can I ask you something else?" "You may ask anything," Ragnarok said. "Gringotts is bound by client privilege. What does Dumbledore actually think right now? Does he know the audit happened? Does he know about the trial?" "He received formal notification this morning, concurrent with your letter," Ragnarok said. "The Goblin Accord requires simultaneous notification of all parties." So Dumbledore had known, since 6 this morning, that Harry knew. And Dumbledore had also known, since 6 this morning, that Hagrid was on his way to Privet Drive with the Hogwarts letter. Harry thought about that. About the timing. About a man who was very, very good at shaping narratives, who had spent 30 years being the most trusted figure in Wizarding Britain, receiving a piece of devastating news and then, within the same morning, dispatching his half-giant groundskeeper to personally deliver a letter to the boy who was about to upend his life. "He's going to try to get ahead of it," Harry said. "He's going to try to talk to me before I understand what I've got." Ragnarok said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Harry stood up. He picked up his copy of the audit documents, which Ragnarok had organized into a neat folder, and the chest of his parents' personal effects, and the bag of gold, and he shook Ragnarok's hand. The goblin's grip was dry and very firm. "Master Potter," Ragnarok said, "I have managed the accounts of a great many ancient and noble houses. Heirs who discover the scope of their inheritance typically respond in one of 3 ways. They panic. They become arrogant. Or they ask the right questions. I'll try to keep asking the right questions," Harry said. Something moved in Ragnarok's ancient face that might, in the right light, have been called a smile. See that you do. Harry walked back through Diagon Alley with his arms full and his mind running at a speed it had never quite been asked to run before. He stopped at Madame Malkin's and bought robes, proper ones, that fit, and at Flourish and Blots, where he bought every book on the Hogwarts list and 3 others, a beginner's guide to wizarding property law, the Goblin Accords, a plain translation, and a slim, dense volume called The Politics of the Wizengamot that the bookseller had looked slightly surprised to see an 11-year-old pick up. He stopped at Ollivander's and got a wand, holly and phoenix feather, 11 inches, pliable, and he stood very still for a moment when the warmth ran up his arm, because it was the first thing in his life that had ever felt like it was specifically his. He had lunch at a small cafe at the far end of the alley, sitting in the corner with his school book stacked beside him and his parents' chest on his lap, and he read the first 40 pages of the Property Law Guide while eating a bowl of soup. He was halfway through the soup when the seat across from him was filled. He looked up. The man was enormous, not fat, just vast, with a wild black beard and hands the size of small shovels and eyes that were bright and kind and currently very startled to find the person they were looking for sitting in a cafe eating soup with a stack of legal documents. "Blimey," said Hagrid. "Harry." "Hi," Harry said. "How did you, Yerry in Diagon Alley, how did ya, bus?" "Then I followed the directions in the pamphlet," Harry said. "Do you want to sit down? There's more soup if you want." Hagrid sat down heavily. The chair complained. "I was supposed to take ya. Supposed to come get ya from the Dursleys and bring ya here myself." "I know," Harry said. "I'm sorry you had a wasted trip. I wanted to get here early, there were some things I needed to sort out." Hagrid was looking at him with an expression Harry was starting to recognize as the one people wore when he wasn't behaving the way they'd expected. "What kind o' things?" "Bank stuff," Harry said, which was true enough. "I'd never been here before. I wanted to get my bearings on my own first." He looked at Hagrid carefully, because Hagrid had a face made entirely for honesty and right now it was doing something complicated. "Dumbledore sent you, didn't he? Specifically today?" "He did," Hagrid said, the complicated thing getting more complicated. "It's an important day, Harry. Your Hogwarts letter, I know about Hogwarts," Harry said, and pulled out his own copy of the letter, the one he'd kept from the second delivery. "I've had this for 3 days. Hagrid stared at it. "How did ya manage to keep it when my uncle tried to confiscate them? There were quite a lot of deliveries." He smiled at Hagrid, because Hagrid hadn't done anything wrong. Hagrid was clearly a man who was told things and believed them and showed up when asked. "I've already got my books, my robes, my wand. I'm sorted for school. He paused, choosing his words. "I'd like to know something, if that's all right." "What's that? Did Dumbledore tell you anything about the Gringotts letter? The one that came before yours?" The change in Hagrid's face was answer enough. A flicker, not of guilt, nothing so intentional as guilt, but of discomfort, the expression of someone who has been told not to mention something and is now being directly asked about it by the person they weren't supposed to tell. He said, Hagrid stopped. "Tried again. He said it were nothing to worry about. A bank thing. Administrative." Harry said. They sat in silence for a moment. Hagrid's enormous hands were wrapped around a cup of tea that the café had materialized for him without being asked, apparently out of self-preservation. "You're a good person," Harry said. "I can see that. And I don't think you know anything about what's in those audit documents." He watched Hagrid's face, making sure. "But I want you to know that I'm fine. I'm not scared, I'm not lost, I'm not, whatever he was worried I'd be if I found out about this on my own. I'm all right. I just know more than I'm supposed to know." Hagrid's eyes were slightly wet. "He means well, Harry. I want ya to know that. He does. He's protected ya all these years, I know he thinks he has," Harry said, gently. He didn't say anything else about it. He offered Hagrid the rest of his soup, which Hagrid declined, and then they spent a pleasant hour walking through Diagon Alley together, because Hagrid was genuinely enthusiastic about showing him things and Harry was genuinely curious, and whatever was happening between Dumbledore and the Wizengamot had nothing to do with Rubeus Hagrid, who had come here in good faith with a birthday cake and a warm heart. At Aesop's Owl Emporium, Harry bought a snowy owl that fixed him with an amber gaze of such profound disdain and intelligence that he felt seen in a way he'd never quite managed with humans. "What are you going to call her?" Hagrid asked. Harry looked at the owl. The owl looked at him. Hedwig, he said, which was the name of a saint he'd found in his school history of magic book, a woman who'd spent her life navigating the gap between enormous power and the question of what you do with it. It seemed appropriate. He sent Hedwig out with a letter to Ragnarok before he left the alley, a short one, confirming that he had reviewed the full audit documents, that he authorized the trial proceedings as described, and that he was available for further consultation through Hedwig, who was reliable. Then he went home to Privet Drive, helped Aunt Petunia with dinner without being asked, and sat through Uncle Vernon's evening complaints about the post and the neighbors and the general state of the world. Dudley ate 4 helpings of pudding. Harry ate 1, quietly, thinking about property law and Wizengamot procedures and what exactly you were supposed to do with a mother's locket and a father's letters when you'd never had either of them to begin with. After dinner, in his cupboard, his last night in the cupboard, he decided, because starting tomorrow he was going to use some of his very considerable wealth to correct at least that particular injustice, he opened the chest. His mother's locket. His father's watch. 2 letters, one in a woman's loopy handwriting and one in a man's messy scrawl, both addressed to him and both dated 1981, written, he realized, in the weeks before they died. A small photograph, moving, of a man with wild hair and round glasses and a woman with red hair and green eyes, laughing at something off camera. Harry sat cross-legged on his cot with the photograph in his hands for a long time. They were laughing. The woman, his mother, covered her mouth when she laughed, and the man put his arm around her shoulders with the easy comfort of someone who'd done it 1,000 times, and they kept looking at something just outside the frame, something that made them laugh again and again, and Harry had absolutely no idea what it was. He was going to find out. Not immediately. Not before he'd dealt with Dumbledore, not before the trial, not before he understood the shape of everything that had been taken from him and decided what he was going to do about it. But eventually. He'd ask. He'd find people who had known them. He'd read the letters. He had time. He was 11 years old with 212 properties and a trial pending and a wand that felt like it had been waiting for him specifically, and he had as much time as he needed. He put the photograph carefully in his shirt pocket, close to his chest. He read both letters from his parents. He read them twice, then folded them with steady hands and put them back. Then he lay down on his cot, closed his eyes, and thought about the scale in Ragnarok's office, the one that kept adjusting, weighing something invisible, constantly recalibrating. Balance, he thought. That was what a scale was for. He would find it. Outside, the summer night was still and warm, and somewhere in the distance, very faintly, he thought he could hear the sound of a cart rattling through deep tunnels beneath a marble building, a bank that was older than the ministry, that answer to older laws, that had just fired a signal flare into the sky of wizarding Britain that was going to change everything. Good, Harry thought. He slept better that night than he had in years. Chapter 2, The letter opens the world. The Hogwarts Express left King's Cross at 11 o'clock on the 1st of September, and Harry was on the platform by 10:15. He'd spent August well. The Dursleys had not, technically, thrown him out, but when Harry had sat down at the breakfast table the morning after his birthday and explained, in a calm and specific voice, that he was a wizard, that he owned several hundred properties across Britain and Europe, and that his legal situation was currently the subject of a binding Wizengamot proceeding, Uncle Vernon had gone through approximately 6 distinct shades of purple before arriving at a silence so complete it was almost restful. Aunt Petunia had sat very still with her teacup and said nothing at all, which Harry found more interesting than Vernon's bluster. There was something in her stillness that wasn't quite surprise. He hadn't pressed her on it. Not yet. What he'd done was move out of the cupboard and into Dudley's second bedroom, which was technically Dudley's overflow toy storage room, and which Harry had cleared out in an afternoon. Vernon had started to object and Harry had placed the Gringotts audit documents on the kitchen table and said, "I'm going to need a postal address for correspondence about the trial," and Vernon had found somewhere else to be. The rest of August he'd spent reading the Property Law Guide, the Goblin Accords translation, the Wisingamot Politics book, which was dry but dense with useful information. His school books, all of them, cover to cover. He'd gone back to Flourish and Blots and bought the companion texts and supplementary volumes for Charms and Transfiguration, because if he was going to be at school with people who'd grown up in the magical world, he was at minimum going to understand the theory before he walked through the door. Hedwig had been busy. Letters went to Ragnarok twice a week, short and specific, asking clarifying questions about the trial timeline and the legal procedures. Ragnarok's answers were equally short and equally specific, which Harry appreciated. Once, a letter came not from Ragnarok but from the office of Madame Amelia Bones, formally acknowledging his authorization of her appointment as presiding officer and confirming that the trial date had been set for the 17th of October. 6 weeks into term. He filed that date carefully. One letter had come from someone he hadn't contacted, a brief, handwritten note on Hogwarts stationery, in a script that was old-fashioned and very neat. "Dear Harry, I understand you've had a busy summer and that there are some administrative matters requiring attention. I want you to know that my door is always open, and that whatever questions or concerns you may have, I hope you'll feel comfortable bringing them to me directly. Hogwarts is your home, and I am, as I have always been, on your side." With warmth and care, Albus Dumbledore. Harry had read it once, recognized it for exactly what it was, an opening move, an offered hand, a carefully constructed signal that said "come to me before this goes further," and then he'd filed it with the Gringotts documents. He hadn't written back. Now he stood on platform 9 3/4 with his trunk, his owl, and a small bag that contained the audit folder, his parents' letters, and the property law books, because he was not leaving those in a dormitory where anyone might find them, and he watched the scarlet steam engine with an expression that probably looked calm from the outside. The platform was absolute chaos, which helped. Parents saying goodbye, owls complaining, cats escaping from carriers, students shouting at each other across the crowd. Harry loaded his trunk, found a compartment, and settled in to watch. That was how he spotted them. 2 boys his age, both clearly from wizarding families, one round-faced and anxious, clutching a toad with the focused desperation of someone who has already lost it twice this morning, and one red-haired with a smear of something on his nose, and 2 older brothers currently ruffling his hair with the aggressive affection of people who are leaving and feel guilty about it. Harry looked at them and then at the compartment and then made a decision. He got up and walked back onto the platform. "Hi," he said to the round-faced boy, who startled and nearly dropped the toad. "Nice toad." "I'm Harry." The boy blinked. "Neville. Neville Longbottom." He looked at the toad. "This is Trevor. He keeps escaping." "Toads are determined," Harry said. "You'd think something that slow would give up, but apparently not." Neville looked at him with the expression of someone who has been expecting to be made fun of and isn't sure what to do with a reasonable response. "Right. Yes. Yes. I've got a compartment," Harry said. "Come sit if you want." He looked at the red-haired boy next, who had finished being assaulted by his brothers and was watching the exchange with the alert expression of someone gauging a social situation. "Ron Weasley," the boy said, before Harry could ask. "You're Harry Potter." "Yeah," Harry said. "I can tell because of the," Ron pointed vaguely at Harry's forehead. "The scar, yeah." Harry had been dealing with this for approximately 6 weeks, and he'd made peace with the fact that it was going to be a feature of every introduction for the foreseeable future. "You're welcome to come sit too, if you want." Ron blinked, apparently having expected something other than this. "Sure. Yeah. Okay." They found the compartment. Hedwig regarded Neville's toad with professional disinterest. Neville put Trevor in his pocket and then spent 10 minutes trying to decide if his pocket was secure enough, which Harry found oddly endearing. Ron talked. He had the comfortable volubility of someone who'd grown up in a large family and therefore associated conversation with belonging, and he told Harry about his brothers, two twins who were apparently chaos given human form, a prefect named Percy who was either very serious or very annoying depending on who you asked, and two older brothers who had already graduated. He talked about his family's house, the Burrow, which sounded cramped and warm and very full, and about growing up knowing about Hogwarts but having to wait his whole life to go. Harry listened, asked the occasional question, and thought about how different it was, not better or worse than silence, but different, to sit in a train compartment and have someone just talk to you. Neville was quieter. He had the look of someone who'd been told to be smaller than he was for a long time, and who'd complied with it, and wasn't entirely sure the policy was correct but hadn't found a reason to revise it yet. He mentioned his grandmother, who was apparently formidable, and his parents, in a way that skipped over something and moved on quickly. Harry noticed the skip. He filed it. He didn't push. The train had been moving for about an hour when the compartment door opened and a girl looked in. She had bushy brown hair and an expression that suggested she'd already been in 4 other compartments and had not found what she was looking for. "Have any of you seen a toad?" she said. "A boy named Neville's lost one." "That's me," Neville said, producing Trevor from his pocket. "Found him again." "Oh, good." The girl's expression shifted from purposeful to something more open. "I'm Hermione. Hermione Granger. I've already sorted out my trunk and there's nothing to do for the next few hours so I've been exploring." She looked at the compartment. "Is there room?" "Yeah," Harry said, and meant it. Hermione sat down and within approximately 4 minutes had demonstrated that she'd read everything on the school reading list plus several supplementary texts, had practiced several of the first-year spells already, and had opinions about all of it. Ron looked slightly overwhelmed. Neville looked like he was trying to decide if this was impressive or exhausting, and landing somewhere in the middle. Harry looked at her and thought, finally, because he'd spent a month reading alone and here was someone who'd apparently done the same. "You've read Magical Theory," he said. "What did you think of the chapter on the principle of equivalent exchange? It seems like it contradicts what Flamel says in the supplementary volume about." Hermione's eyes went very wide. "About the conservation exceptions, yes, I thought exactly that." Ron looked between them with the expression of someone watching a tennis match in a language he doesn't speak. They talked theory for 40 minutes. It was, Harry thought, the best conversation he'd had all summer. Hermione was fast, she'd get there half a breath before him, or he'd get there half a breath before her, and either way there was that particular satisfaction of a mind matching pace with another mind. She also noticed things. Halfway through a discussion of wand theory she looked at him and said, quite directly, "You know more than someone who just found out they were a wizard 2 months ago." "I read a lot," Harry said. "So do I," she said. "But I grew up knowing about this world." "You're 2 months in and you're already discussing Flamel's conservation exceptions." "The library at Privet Drive is terrible," Harry said. "So I bought good books." She looked at him steadily for a moment. There was something perceptive in her gaze. She was, Harry was already certain, extraordinarily sharp, but she let it go. Not because she wasn't curious. Because she'd decided to. He appreciated that. The Hogwarts Express rolled through countryside that grew progressively wilder and more dramatic, and at some point the lights in the corridor dimmed and the lunch trolley came and Ron discovered Harry had money for sweets, real money, not the kind you check twice before spending, and his eyes went large for a moment before Harry bought enough for the whole compartment, matter-of-factly, without making anything of it. It was Neville who said it, quietly, when Hermione and Ron were arguing about something involving chocolate frog cards. He leaned over slightly and said, "You're Harry Potter," in a way that was different from Ron's earlier statement, less observation, more acknowledgement, like he was working up to something. "Yeah," Harry said. "My parents were in the Order of the Phoenix," Neville said. "During the war. With Dumbledore." He stopped. "They were, something happened to them. After. They're at St. Mungo's." Harry looked at him. "I was wondering," Neville said, very carefully, not meeting Harry's eyes, whether you knew anything about what it was like. What they were like. People who were in the order. Harry thought about what he'd read. About what Ragnarok had told him. About what he was still in the process of learning. I'm still finding out, he said honestly. But I'd like to know about your parents, if you want to tell me sometime. Neville nodded, still not quite meeting his eyes, but something in his shoulders relaxed. They arrived at Hogsmeade Station in the dark, which Harry thought was probably the point. It was more dramatic, the first view of the castle across the black water, lit up against the sky. It worked. Even he, who had spent a month building intellectual armor against being overwhelmed by the magical world, felt something move in his chest at the sight of it. Hagrid called the first years across the lake in boats, and Harry sat with Neville and watched the castle grow larger, and thought about the man waiting inside it. He thought he was probably about to see exactly how Albus Dumbledore handled a situation he couldn't control. Professor McGonagall met them at the castle doors with the particular air of someone who is professionally unimpressed by anything but is making an effort to be welcoming. She was sharp-featured, precise, dressed in tartan, and her eyes moved across the group of first years with the practiced assessment of a woman who had been doing this for a very long time. They stopped on Harry. Just for a moment, a flicker of something that wasn't quite surprise, more like recognition, like she was checking something off against something she'd already noted. Then she moved on. Harry filed that too. The sorting was what it was. He stood in the line of nervous first years and watched the hat get placed on head after head. Hermione went to Gryffindor immediately and sat down looking like she'd been expecting it, which she probably had. Neville's hat deliberated for a while before Gryffindor, and Neville's relief was visible across the room. When they called Potter, Harry, the room did what rooms apparently did, a wave of whispers, turning heads, the particular quality of attention that came with a name that carried history. He walked up. He sat on the stool. Professor McGonagall placed the hat on his head. The hat's voice in his head was immediate and unexpectedly conversational. Well. You're not what I expected. Harry didn't say anything, because he wasn't sure how to talk to a hat. You could, the hat said, apparently amused by his uncertainty. I can hear thoughts, not just receive them. What I'm looking at here is, let me see, considerable intelligence, yes, but more than that. Strategy. You've already been playing a long game for 6 weeks and you're 11 years old. That's either Slytherin or Ravenclaw. Or Gryffindor, Harry thought back, deliberately. Gryffindors are brave, the hat said. But your bravery isn't the loud sort. It's the kind that does its research first. Then I'll be the first Gryffindor who does research, Harry thought. The hat made a sound that was disturbingly close to a laugh. You've been telling yourself that story about not being afraid of anyone. I'm checking whether it's true. A pause. Yes. It is. Gryffindor. The table cheered. Harry took the hat off and handed it back to Professor McGonagall, who took it from him and held his gaze for exactly 1 second longer than necessary. He sat down next to Neville and across from Hermione, who was watching him with that sharp attention she'd shown on the train, and he watched the rest of the sorting, Ron to Gryffindor, a Draco Malfoy to Slytherin with the air of someone who considered anything else a personal insult, and then the headmaster stood to give his welcome. Albus Dumbledore was exactly what the wizarding world wanted him to be. That was the first thing Harry noticed. Tall, white-haired, half-moon spectacles, robes that managed to be both eccentric and authoritative, he was performing Albus Dumbledore with the ease of someone who'd been doing it for 60 years and couldn't separate the performance from the reality anymore. His voice was warm and measured and full of exactly the right amount of gentle humor. Welcome, he said, to another year at Hogwarts. To our new students, hello. To our returning students, welcome back. A few start-of-term notices. The Forbidden Forest remains forbidden. Mr. Filch has added 17 items to the banned objects list, copies available on request, and I remind everyone that the third-floor corridor on the right-hand side is out of bounds to all who do not wish to suffer a very unpleasant death. He said this last part in the same tone as everything else, which Harry noted with interest. And now, Dumbledore said, smiling down the table, let us eat. His eyes found Harry's during the feast. Just once, a brief scan down the Gryffindor table that paused, naturally, easily, with the warmth of someone who was genuinely glad to see the boy who survived, and then moved on. Nothing in the look that suggested crisis. Nothing that suggested the morning of September 1st had been anything other than routine. He was good. He was, Harry thought, genuinely extraordinarily good. Harry smiled back, warmly, and reached for the roast potatoes. After the feast, Professor McGonagall gathered the Gryffindor first years and led them through the castle to Gryffindor Tower. She walked quickly and explained the password briskly and showed them the common room, which was round and warm and full of squashy chairs and the particular smell of old wood and fireplace. Potter, she said, as the other students dispersed toward the dormitories. Her voice was neutral, but there was an edge under it. He turned. The other first years went up the stairs. Hermione went last, and Harry caught the flicker of curiosity in her face as she went. She'd file it, he thought. She filed everything. McGonagall looked at him. She had the bearing of someone who was accustomed to being the most prepared person in a room and was currently recalibrating. I want you to know, she said quietly, that my door is also open to you. As your head of house, I am your primary point of contact for anything that concerns your welfare or your academic progress. Thank you, Professor. The current situation, she said, and the pause before situation was precise and controlled, does not need to affect your first term here. This is your school. Your home. Whatever else is happening, you are here to learn. I know, Harry said. She looked at him for a moment. You're not frightened, she said. It wasn't accusatory. It was almost wondering. Should I be? She opened her mouth, closed it. Something moved in her face, not quite conflict, but its precursor. Good night, Mr. Potter. Good night, Professor. He went up to the dormitory, where Ron was already bouncing on his bed and Neville was carefully placing Trevor's tank on his bedside table and a boy named Seamus Finnegan was telling Dean Thomas about something that had apparently exploded during the summer. Harry changed, got into bed, and lay there listening to the sounds of 5 boys settling into a new place. He lasted approximately 20 minutes before he got up, took the audit folder and the property law book from his bag, and settled cross-legged on his bed with the curtains drawn and a small lumos he'd figured out from the theory chapter, casting just enough light to read by. The trial was in 43 days. He opened the Wisengamot Politics book to the chapter on impeachment proceedings and read until 1 in the morning. The next 40 days passed the way the beginning of something long and important passes, fast in the broad strokes and very detailed in the small ones. Charms with Professor Flitwick, who was tiny and enthusiastic and genuinely delighted when Harry's Wingardium Leviosa was correct on the second attempt. Transfiguration with McGonagall, who taught them to turn matchsticks into needles and who looked at Harry's needle with an expression she controlled very quickly. Potions with Professor Snape, who swept into the dungeon classroom like weather and opened with a speech about the beauty and power of potions that was actually, Harry thought, quite good, and then called on Harry as a demonstration of the gap between book learning and practical knowledge, clearly expecting to find nothing. What would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood, Potter? Harry met his eyes. Draught of living death. One of the most powerful sleeping potions in existence. The combination of asphodel and wormwood is actually part of a wider alchemical principle about the synergy between lily family plants. Asphodel is a flower associated with the afterlife in Greek tradition, and wormwood was used in funerary preparations by European herbalists. Snape was quiet for a moment. Where would you look if I told you to find me a bezoar? Stomach of a goat. It's an antidote for most poisons. The name comes from Persian, padzar, literally, counterpoison. Another pause. What is the difference between monkshood and wolfsbane? There isn't one. Same plant. Also called aconite. It's used in the wolfsbane potion for werewolves, helps them retain their human mind during transformation. It's extremely toxic in its raw form. Snape looked at him for a long moment with an expression Harry couldn't read. Then he said, "It seems celebrity isn't entirely without substance," which in the context of a Snape opening speech was probably the closest thing to a compliment on offer, and moved on. Hermione was furious about it. In the abstract way she was furious when something she valued was being undermined. "He's deliberately trying to embarrass students," she said at dinner. "It's a horrible teaching approach. You're only allowed to know things if he's the one who taught them to you. Or if you're willing to prove it in public," Harry said. "That's not how learning should work." "No," Harry agreed. "But it's how this is going to work, so we may as well know the rules." Hermione looked at him, slightly annoyed and slightly impressed. "You're very pragmatic for someone our age." "Cupboard," Harry said. "What?" "I grew up in a cupboard," he said, not with self-pity, just as information. "You learn to work with what you have." She was quiet for a moment, then, "That's not right." "No," he agreed. It wasn't. And then he reached for more potatoes, because it was done and he'd deal with the right and wrong of it later, and right now there was dinner. She let it go, but he could see her thinking about it. It was on the 32nd day of term, a Thursday evening, 2 weeks before the trial, that Dumbledore summoned him. The note came via McGonagall, delivered at breakfast with an expression she controlled very carefully. "The headmaster would like to see you in his office at 7 o'clock this evening." Harry read it, folded it, and tucked it in his pocket. "What's that?" Ron asked. "Headmaster wants to see me." Ron's eyes went wide. "Already? What did you do?" "Nothing interesting," Harry said, "and had some eggs." Hermione watched him across the table with that look she was developing, the one that said she knew there was a larger picture and she was assembling it from pieces, and she was getting close to the edge of what Harry had told her. He'd told her more than he'd told anyone else, about the Gringotts audit, about the properties, about the nature of what Dumbledore had done. He hadn't told her about the trial yet, because until 2 days ago there was nothing she could do with the information and it seemed unfair to carry that weight. After breakfast he caught her in the corridor and said, quietly, "I'll tell you what happens. Tonight, after." She nodded. "I'll be in the common room." Dumbledore's office was at the top of a spiral staircase behind a gargoyle that Harry now knew to jump aside for the password sherbet lemon, which Hermione had looked up in a history of the school she'd found in the library. The office itself was extraordinary, full of silver instruments that whirred and clicked, portraits of former headmasters sleeping or watching with interest, and a pervasive sense of enormous accumulated history. A large red and gold bird sat on a perch near the window, watching Harry with one bright eye. Fox, Harry thought. A phoenix. He knew about phoenixes from his reading. He wondered what the bird thought of all this. Dumbledore sat behind his desk and gestured to the chair across from it with the warm generosity of a man welcoming a guest into his home, rather than someone calling a student before him. "Harry," he said. "Thank you for coming. Please, sit." Harry sat. For a moment neither of them said anything, and Harry used the moment to look at Dumbledore the way he'd been wanting to since the feast, not across a great hall with 100 people between them, but close, face to face. He was old. Really old, in the way the property law books were old, carrying layers of history, of decisions made and not made, of compromises accumulated into architecture. His eyes were very blue and very sharp behind the spectacles, and they were looking at Harry with something that was genuine. Not manufactured warmth, not the performance of caring, something real. That was the hardest part, Harry thought. He was real. He genuinely loved, in whatever complicated way he was capable of loving, the idea of Harry Potter, the boy who survived. He probably even loved the actual Harry, the specific child, to the extent he'd allowed himself to think about the actual child. He'd just decided it didn't matter as much as the greater good. "I expect you know why I wanted to see you," Dumbledore said. "The trial," Harry said. "Yes." He didn't try to soften it or redirect it. That too, Harry thought, was real. He wasn't going to pretend. "I owe you a conversation. And possibly," he said, with a kind of precise honesty, "an apology." "Possibly," Harry agreed. Dumbledore's eyes moved over him, assessing something, Harry thought, not calculating how to manage him, but genuinely trying to understand who he was looking at. "You're not what I expected," he said, almost exactly what the Sorting Hat had said, which Harry found interesting. "What did you expect?" "A boy who needed guidance." The answer was honest. "Who would come to me confused and frightened and needing someone to explain the world to him. I planned to do that. To be the person who told you what was happening and why, and to put it in a context that would help you understand the decisions I made." "You wanted to get there first," Harry said. "Before I had the full picture." Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "I did." "Why did you do it?" Harry asked. "Not the money," he knew the money was part of something larger. "Why the properties? Where did the money go?" "The properties were providing returns that exceeded what the estate could efficiently manage," Dumbledore said, and Harry heard the cadence of a man who had rehearsed this, not to lie, but to explain a thing he believed in. The funds were directed towards several initiatives: support for families who had lost members in the war, a fund for Hogwarts students who couldn't afford school materials, certain intelligence resources that were necessary in the years following Voldemort's defeat. "Without my knowledge," Harry said. "You were an infant," Dumbledore said. "Then a child." "I turned 11 this summer," Harry said. "The audit happened automatically on my birthday because that's when the protocols activate. Between 1 and 11, I understand. But you were planning to keep managing those properties. The leases run through 1998. I'm 17 in 1998. The silence that followed was brief but very full. "You were going to wait until I was 17, Harry said. "And then, what? Tell me. Or renew the leases?" "I hadn't fully decided," Dumbledore said, and to his credit he said it without flinching. Harry looked at him. The fire crackled. The instruments whirred softly. Fawkes made a low, mournful sound. "I believe," Harry said, "that you did what you thought was right. And I believe that some of it, some of what that money paid for, was probably genuinely good. And I think that you are a person of real principle and real intelligence and real love for the wizarding world." Dumbledore's expression shifted slightly, something that might have been relief. "But," Harry said, "you took from me without asking. You took things that weren't yours. You decided that what you wanted to do with my inheritance was more important than my right to choose what happened to my own property. And you planned to keep doing it for another 7 years." He paused. "That's not guidance. That's control." "Harry, I'm not angry," Harry said, clearly. "I want you to understand that. I'm not here to be angry at you. I'm here because the trial is in 2 weeks and I thought we should talk before it, and I wanted you to know that I don't hate you." He leaned forward slightly in the chair. "But I am going to let it go to trial. I am going to let Madame Bones run the proceeding. I am going to let Ragnarok present the audit. And I'm going to ask you to let it happen without trying to stop it or shape it or redirect it." Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. "And if I said the trial would cause more harm than good? That the disruption to, then I would say," Harry said, calmly, "that you are doing it again." The room was very quiet. Then Dumbledore did something Harry hadn't expected. He leaned back in his chair, removed his spectacles, and rubbed his eyes, not a theatrical gesture but a genuinely tired one, the gesture of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has just been asked to put it down. "You are," he said quietly, "remarkably like your mother." "I'll take that," Harry said. He stood up. "I'll see you in class, Professor," he said. "And at the trial." He walked back through the castle to Gryffindor Tower, and the whole way he thought about the look on Dumbledore's face at the end, not anger, not calculation, but something quieter and harder to name. Something that might have been the beginning of actually seeing him. The common room was quiet by the time he arrived. Most students had gone to bed. Hermione was in the chair nearest the fire with 2 books open on her lap, which Harry suspected meant she'd been too preoccupied to actually read either one. She looked up when he came in. He sat in the chair across from her, stretched his feet toward the fire, and told her everything, the full audit, the full history, the conversation tonight, all of it, in a steady voice that covered the ground without drama. She listened without interrupting, which was not her natural mode but which she managed. When he finished she was quiet for a moment, processing. "The trial is in 2 weeks, she said. 17th of October. And you're going?" "I have to be there as the injured party. Ragnar's already arranged it, Ministry has to accommodate Goblin Accord procedures." "Then I'm coming," she said. Flat. Not a question. Harry looked at her. "You don't have to, I know I don't have to," she said. "I want to." "You shouldn't have to do something like that alone." She hesitated, then added with the careful precision of someone choosing their words, "Also, I've read everything I can find about Wisengamot procedure in the past 3 weeks and I want to see how it actually works." Harry almost smiled. "Of course you have." "Don't," she said, but she was fighting a smile of her own. The fire crackled. Above them, the castle breathed around its students, and somewhere in the upper floors, Harry knew, the portrait of Albus Dumbledore I was probably already having a conversation with the Albus Dumbledore who was currently sitting in that chair, rubbing his eyes. Let them talk, Harry thought. He'd been in that room. He'd said what needed saying. Now it was time for the law. Chapter 3, The Trial of Albus Dumbledore. The Ministry of Magic was underground, which Harry thought said something about it. He arrived through the visitor's entrance, a red telephone box on a side street that Ragnar's assistant had directed him to, at 8:30 on the morning of the 17th of October, wearing his best school robes with a pressed collar that Hermione had insisted on the night before with the focused energy of someone channeling anxiety into something useful. Hermione was beside him. Neville had asked to come, quietly, the evening before, and Harry had said yes without hesitation, because Neville had his own reasons and they mattered. They rode down through the earth in the telephone box together, the 3 of them, standing in a space made for one adult and currently occupied by 2 11-year-olds and a girl who was managing to look both nervous and aggressively prepared. "You've got the documents," Hermione said. "Yes." "The Goblin Accord reference pages?" "Yes." "The financial summary Ragnar sent?" Hermione. "Right. Sorry. You've got them." Neville said nothing, but he'd straightened his spine at some point during the descent and was now standing like someone who had decided to be taller than he was. The atrium was enormous and golden and full of the particular busyness of a government building on an ordinary working morning, witches and wizards in robes crossing the polished floor, memos in paper aeroplane form darting overhead, the fountain in the center depicting 5 magical figures in heroic poses that Harry had read enough political history to find slightly hollow. Ragnar was waiting for them. He was not alone. Beside him stood a woman in plum-colored robes who had the build and the bearing of someone who had handled difficult situations in difficult rooms for a very long time and found the experience neither exciting nor exhausting but simply professional. Her hair was iron gray, cut short and practical. Her eyes, behind a pair of square spectacles, were the precise amber of someone who had learned to see past what people wanted them to see. "Master Potter," Ragnar said. "This is Madame Amelia Bones." "I know who you are," Amelia Bones said, shaking his hand. Her grip was direct. "I've read the full audit twice. I want you to know that I will run this proceeding according to the law exactly as written, and that I have no interest in any outcome other than the one the evidence supports. Is that acceptable to you?" "Yes," Harry said. She looked at him for a moment with the same recalibrating expression he'd been getting from adults for 6 weeks. Then she nodded briskly and turned to business. "The hearing is in courtroom 10. We convene in 40 minutes. Ragnarok will present the audit evidence first, then the Wisengamot will have questions, then the defense will have the floor. You will be called as the injured party near the end. Your testimony is limited in scope, but within that scope, you may speak plainly. Do you understand? Yes. Do you have questions? 1. Harry said. What's the mood of the Wisengamot? How many of them are going to be looking for a way out? Amelia Bones looked at him steadily. Of the 50 currently seated members, I estimate perhaps 12 who will vote for Dumbledore on principle regardless of evidence, 8 who are genuinely undecided and will follow the law, and the remaining 30 who are in a range between uncomfortable and actively alarmed by the audit findings. The 12 in Dumbledore's corner are not a majority, but they will be loud. She paused. I tell you this because you asked, not because I expect it to change anything about how the hearing runs. It doesn't, Harry said. Thank you. She left to take her position. Ragnarok fell into step beside Harry as they crossed toward the courtroom lifts. You've reviewed the full financial trace? Harry asked. Completed yesterday evening, Ragnarok said. The complete trail of the 450,000 galleons has been mapped. Approximately 200,000 went to accounts held under the names of various charitable organizations, of which 60% are legitimate and 40% are shells or have unverifiable recipients. 100,000 went to what appears to be an intelligence network, safe houses, informants, certain surveillance operations that predated and post-dated the war. The remaining 150,000 is distributed across accounts that will require further legal proceedings to fully examine. So some of it genuinely did go to good causes, Harry said. Yes, Ragnarok said, without inflection. And he knew that would come out in evidence. He would have to assume it would. Harry thought about that as the lift descended. It was, he thought, Dumbledore's actual defense, not I didn't do it but I did it and here is what I did it for, and he would be hoping that the list of genuine good works was impressive enough to mitigate the fundamental violation of taking someone else's property without consent for 10 years. It might even work, on enough of the Wisengamot members. The question was whether it should. Courtroom 10 was not what Harry had expected. He'd read about the Wisengamot in a politics book, he'd built a mental image of something imposing and formal, high benches, cathedral gravity. The reality was more brutal than that. Stone walls, chains on the single chair in the center of the floor that presumably were there to bind a defendant if needed, tiered wooden benches rising in a semicircle, lit by torches that made everyone look like they'd come from somewhere very old and were deciding the fates of things that mattered. It was full. Not just with the Wisengamot members, the 50 robed figures taking their places on the upper benches, talking quietly, several of them already looking toward Harry with various flavors of calculation, but with observers. The gallery above the main floor was packed. Harry recognized several faces from the portraits in Hogwarts, a man he was fairly certain was a former minister for magic, 2 journalists with quick quotes quills already poised, and a scattering of faces he didn't know but who all had the polished quality of people who were there to watch history. At the far end of the chamber, in the chair in the center of the floor, sat Albus Dumbledore. He was not bound, the chains hadn't moved, and he sat with the ease of someone who had chosen to be in this chair rather than been placed in it, upright and composed in deep blue robes, his hands folded in his lap. He looked, Harry thought, like a man who had prepared for this in his own way, and whose preparation involved a kind of dignified acceptance that was as much performance as anything else, but was also, underneath the performance, something genuine. He looked old. Genuinely old, in a way the Hogwarts firelight didn't show. His eyes found Harry as Harry entered, and Harry held the gaze steadily, and Dumbledore gave a small, precise nod, the nod of one chess player to another before the game begins, and then looked away. Amelia Bones took the presiding chair above the arc of Wisengamot benches and called the chamber to order with a single rap of her gavel. This hearing is convened under the authority of the Goblin Accord of 1478, Articles 7 through 12, governing the management of assets held in trust for magical heirs. The presiding officer is Madame Amelia Bones, appointed by Gringotts Wizarding Bank as required under the Accord. The defendant is Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore. The injured party is Harry James Potter, heir to the ancient and noble house of Potter. These proceedings are binding under both goblin and wizarding law. They are being recorded in full. She looked out over the chamber. We will begin with the presentation of evidence by Gringotts Wizarding Bank. Ragnarok walked to the center of the floor and set a leather case on the table beside the witness position with the composure of someone who had absolutely no nerves about being in a room full of the most powerful wizards in Britain. The audit, he said, without preamble, was triggered automatically on the 31st of July, 1991, the 11th birthday of Harry James Potter, heir to the Potter estate. The audit covers all Potter family holdings registered at Gringotts under the ancient and noble house protocols, encompassing primary vault assets, secondary investment portfolios, and all real property held in trust. He opened the case and withdrew a thick bound document. What the audit found, documented in full in the report before you, is as follows. He was precise. He was methodical. He did not editorialize, dramatize, or pause for effect. He simply laid the facts on the floor of courtroom 10 one by one, in order, like stones being placed to build a wall. The properties. The leases. The dates. The amounts. The accounts the money moved through. The documentation Dumbledore had submitted to Gringotts in 1981 claiming magical guardian authority. The absence of any legal mechanism, in wizarding law or the Goblin Accord, that gave a magical guardian the right to lease and profit from a ward's property without either the ward's consent or the appointment of a Gringotts certified estate trustee. The total amount extracted from the Potter estate over 10 years, Ragnarok concluded, is 452,714 galleons, 8 sickles, and 3 nuts. The specific financial trail is documented in Appendix 4. He closed the report. Gringotts presents this evidence without recommendation as to verdict. We have fulfilled our obligation under the accord. He returned to his seat. The Wisingamot chamber was very quiet. Not shocked quiet, these were not people who shocked easily, but the particular quality of quiet that settles when a very large piece of information has been presented and needs to be integrated. Amelia Bones let it sit for exactly the right amount of time. Then, the Wisingamot will hear questions for the Gringotts representative. What followed was an hour of questions, and Harry sat in his seat in the observer gallery. He'd been placed there by Bones's assistant, Hermione and Neville on either side of him, and watched the Wisingamot work. Some of them were trying to find holes in the audit methodology. Ragnarok closed each hole with the same flat patience, citing specific accord articles and specific ledger entries. Some were asking clarifying questions that were genuinely aimed at understanding the full picture. And some, the 12 Hermione had been briefed on, or most of them, were asking questions that were shaped not toward understanding but toward giving Dumbledore something to use. Framing questions that introduced the concept of necessity, of wartime exigency, of the particular sacrifices made by those who had carried the weight of the resistance against Voldemort. Harry watched and listened and catalogued. Hermione was taking notes. She'd produced a notepad and a quick notes quill from somewhere and was writing in a small, dense hand, occasionally adding asterisks and arrows connecting things. Neville sat quietly and watched Dumbledore with an expression that was hard to read, not hatred, nothing as simple as that, but something careful and ongoing. He's watching the Wisingamot, not the evidence, Neville said quietly, at one point. Harry glanced at him. What? Dumbledore, Neville said, very quietly. He's not watching Ragnarok. He's watching the members. He knows what's in the evidence, he lived it. He's assessing the room. Harry looked at Dumbledore and saw that Neville was exactly right. Dumbledore's eyes were moving steadily, systematically, across the tiered benches, and his face was making the smallest possible adjustments, a fractional relaxation when a friendly voice asked a question, a stillness when an unfriendly one pressed on something. He was reading the room. He had probably never stopped reading the room. He's deciding how to pitch the defense, Harry said. He's very good, Neville said, without admiration. Just observation. Yeah, Harry said. He is. After the questions concluded, Amelia Bones called a 20-minute recess, and Harry used it to find the small room off the main corridor where Ragnarok had set up the Potter estate's documents. He stood at the table and looked over the material one more time, not because he'd forgotten anything, but because it settled him, the physical act of looking at the evidence, being sure it was solid. "You're going to testify soon," Hermione said, appearing in the doorway. "I know. How are you feeling?" He looked at her. She had her notepad under her arm and her hair was doing something complicated from the torchlight, and her expression was managing the difficult balance between practical and caring. "Fine," he said, and it was true. "I know what I want to say. Do you want to go over it?" "No." He picked up the audit folder. "I've been going over it for 6 weeks. At some point you have to stop preparing and just say the thing." She looked at him for a moment. "Right." She paused. "For what it's worth, you're doing the right thing." "I know," Harry said. Not arrogantly. Just with the certainty of someone who has thought about something thoroughly enough to not need external validation. "I know." The defense began after the recess. Dumbledore stood and spoke without notes, which was either confidence or arrogance, and in his case Harry thought it was probably both at once. His voice filled the chamber with the ease of someone who understood acoustics and audience simultaneously. He thanked the Wizengamot for their attention. He thanked Madame Bones for the integrity of her oversight. He acknowledged, clearly and without equivocation, that the audit findings were accurate. Every galleon documented in the audit report was extracted from the Potter estate, he said. "I do not dispute this. I did not do it in secret from myself. I knew what I was doing, why I was doing it, and what I was doing it for. And I will tell you." He talked for 45 minutes. He talked about 1981, about the state of wizarding Britain in the immediate aftermath of Voldemort's fall, the chaos, the fear, the number of Death Eaters who had claimed imperious curses and walked free, the genuine, documented danger to surviving members of the Order of the Phoenix and their families. He talked about the intelligence network, named the specific safe houses, named the families who had sheltered in them, several of whom were represented in the chamber. He talked about the charitable funds, named the families, named the children, named the amounts. He was specific. He was honest. He was devastating in the way only truth strategically deployed can be devastating. And then he said, "I will not pretend that I had the legal authority to do what I did. I acted under moral authority, which is different. I looked at an 11-year-old boy who could not exercise his own rights, at an estate generating income that could save lives, and I made a choice. I chose the living over the administrative." He paused, and his voice dropped into something quieter. "I chose wrong," he said. "Not in the purposes to which the funds were directed. I am not ashamed of those purposes. But in the act of taking what was not mine to take, even for reasons I stand behind, I was wrong. Harry Potter deserved the right to make those choices himself. That is not something I can argue around. I could only have done what I did because I had allowed myself to believe, for too long, that I knew better than everyone else what was right." He looked across the chamber, and his eyes, for one moment, found Harry in the gallery. "I am sorry, Harry. I mean that without qualification." The chamber was very quiet. Harry sat in the gallery and felt the weight of the apology, the real weight of it, because it was real. He knew it was real. That was the complicated part. It didn't change anything. Amelia Bones called a second recess, and when the chamber reconvened she called Harry Potter as the injured party. He came down from the gallery and stood at the witness position in the center of the floor, and the Wizengamot looked at him from their benches, and the journalists in the gallery had their quills raised, and Albus Dumbledore sat 12 feet away and watched him with the patient attention of someone who had made his peace with whatever came next. Harry looked out at the room. He thought of his cupboard. He thought of his parents in the photograph, laughing at something he couldn't see. He thought of Trevor the Toad, and Hermione's notepad, and the scale in Ragnarok's office that was always recalibrating. Then he spoke. I found out I was a wizard 6 weeks ago, he said. And on the same morning I found out that someone had been managing my inheritance without my knowledge for 10 years. Not spending it on himself, I want to be clear about that, and I believe Professor Dumbledore that the purposes were largely good. But without my knowledge. Without my consent. Without ever sitting down with the people managing my accounts and saying, the Potter estate is generating X amount, would you like to decide what to do with it? He was speaking to the room, but he wasn't performing for it. He was just saying the true thing. I'm 11 years old, he said. I grew up in a cupboard under my aunt and uncle's stairs. I didn't know I had a vault at Gringotts. I didn't know I owned properties. I didn't know my parents had left me something. And when I found out, through a bank audit, not through the man who was supposed to be my magical guardian, the thing I kept coming back to wasn't anger. It was, who decided that was all right? Who decided that the child didn't get to know? And the answer is that one person decided, and then that decision ran for 10 years, because that one person never looked at it again and asked if it was still right. He was quiet for a moment. Professor Dumbledore said he chose the living over the administrative. I understand that. I appreciate what that money paid for. But I want the Wisingamot to consider something. I am the living. I was the living, for all 10 of those years. And nobody chose me. He paused. I am not asking for Professor Dumbledore to be imprisoned. That's not what this is. I'm asking for the Wisingamot to look at a system that allowed one person, however good, however well-intentioned, to exercise unchecked control over a child's inheritance for a decade with no oversight and no accountability, and to decide that the system needs to change. He stopped. The room was very still. That's all I have, he said. He walked back up to the gallery, passing close enough to Dumbledore to see the old man's face clearly. Dumbledore was looking at him with an expression Harry hadn't seen from him before, not the warm performance, not the strategic assessment, but something that looked, painfully, like actual regret. Not the manageable kind that people carried around without looking at. The sharp kind. The kind that cuts. Harry met his eyes for a moment. Then he went back up to his seat. The Wisingamot deliberated for 90 minutes. Harry and Hermione and Neville sat in the gallery and Hermione shared out sandwiches she'd thought to pack, which was the most practical thing anyone had done all day, and they ate in comfortable silence while below them 5 decades of accumulated magical political weight ground slowly toward a verdict. He might walk, Neville said, at one point. Not bitterly. Just noting it. He won't fully walk, Harry said. Ragnarok's evidence is too clean. But yes, some of them are going to vote for him regardless of the evidence, and that might dilute the verdict. Does it matter? Neville asked. If it's diluted? Harry thought about it. The verdict's not actually the point, he said. The point is that it happened. That the evidence is on record. That the audit documents are public record now. That means the next person who tries to run a ward's estate without oversight is going to have to answer the same questions in the same room. Neville was quiet for a moment. My family's estate was managed by the firm of wizards my grandmother appointed, he said slowly. After my parents, after. I've never seen the documents. Harry looked at him. Do you want me to ask Ragnarok? Neville met his eyes. Yeah, he said. I think I do. Amelia Bones called the chamber back to order at 3 o'clock, and the Wisingamot filed back to their benches, and she stood and read the verdict with the crisp directness of someone who was going to say it clearly regardless of how the room received it. On the charge of unauthorized management of a protected estate under the Goblin Accord Articles 7 through 12, guilty, by a vote of 38 to 12. The gallery erupted. Not in chaos, in noise, the noise of a lot of people simultaneously having large reactions and trying to process them. The journalists' quills were moving so fast they were nearly blurs. Several Wisingamot members were speaking to each other in urgent undertones. Dumbledore sat still. Sentencing will proceed as follows, Bones continued, over the noise, with the tone of someone who has not finished and intends to be heard. The noise settled. Financial restitution, the full 452,714 galleons, 8 sickles, and 3 nuts is to be returned to the Potter estate within 30 days. Any funds that cannot be recovered from the charitable accounts are to be made up from Professor Dumbledore's personal estate. She paused. Additionally, by order of this Wizengamot, Professor Dumbledore is hereby stripped of the position of Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot, pending a period of financial supervision by Gringotts Wizarding Bank of no less than 5 years. He retains all other positions, including Headmaster of Hogwarts and Supreme Mugwump of the International Confederation of Wizards, pending review by the relevant governing bodies. She set down her papers. The magical guardianship of Harry James Potter is formally transferred to the administration of Gringotts Wizarding Bank until such time as a suitable guardian is identified and approved by both the Ministry and the bank. This hearing is concluded. The gavel came down. The noise in the gallery went from significant to extraordinary. Harry sat in his seat and let it happen around him, and beside him Hermione had stopped writing notes and was looking at her notepad with a complicated expression, and Neville had his hands pressed flat on his thighs like he was keeping himself from doing something. Below them, Dumbledore stood from the chair in the center of the floor. Several Wizengamot members came down toward him immediately, the 12 who had voted against, gathering close with the urgency of people who needed to say they were still there. Some of the other 38 stayed in their seats, watching. Amelia Bones was already in conference with a ministry official, brisk and focused. Ragnarok appeared at Harry's shoulder like he'd been there all along. The restitution process will begin tomorrow, he said quietly. I've already prepared the accounts. The full amount will be in your vault within the 30-day period. Thank you, Harry said. For all of it. Ragnarok gave him the same look he'd given him in that first meeting in the office, the flat assessment of someone taking a measurement. Then, the Longbottom inquiry you mentioned. I will have preliminary information within the week. Harry blinked. I didn't formally request, you asked the question, Ragnarok said. At Gringotts, questions of that nature are taken as requests. He turned to go, then paused. You spoke well, Master Potter. Not like an 11-year-old. Someone kept asking me the right questions, Harry said, so I had to learn how to answer them. Ragnarok left without responding, but his back had the quality of a man who was not displeased. They were moving toward the exit when Harry heard his name, and turned. Minerva McGonagall was standing at the edge of the gallery, in her teaching robes, which meant she'd come directly from Hogwarts, which meant she'd made a choice to be here. Her face was doing something complicated and controlled. Potter, she said. A word, if you please. Hermione touched his arm briefly and she and Neville moved ahead, giving them space. McGonagall looked at him for a moment before speaking. Not stalling, thinking. As though she'd come here with something prepared and was now recalculating. You conducted yourself with remarkable maturity today, she said finally. Thank you, Professor. I want to ask you something and I would like an honest answer. She held his gaze directly. Are you all right? Not politically. Not legally. You. Are you all right? Harry looked at her, and something about the directness of it, the fact that she'd asked about him and meant it, not the case, not the verdict, but him specifically, landed somewhere he hadn't been expecting. I don't know yet, he said honestly. I think I will be. She nodded. Good. She was quiet for a moment. I want you to know, I want you to understand, that I didn't know. About the properties. About the extent of the management. Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it that cost her. I am not offering that as an excuse for things I perhaps should have questioned. I am offering it because I think you deserve to know that not everyone around you was complicit. Harry looked at her. There was a kind of pain in her face that was the specific pain of a person discovering that their trust in someone has been more complete than the evidence warranted, and that this completeness was, in itself, a kind of failure. I know, he said. I never thought you were. Something in her face shifted. You should also know, she said, carefully, that what you said in there, about the system, about oversight, about not putting so much power in one person's hands, several members of the Wiesengemot used almost those exact words when they were deliberating. Harry absorbed that. Good. Indeed. She looked at him for one more moment. Come see me when you're back at school. We should discuss your academic progress. You have been in some of those theory texts for first and second year simultaneously, which your professors have noted. Is that a problem? Quite the opposite, she said, and left. Harry found Hermione and Neville in the atrium by the fountain. Hermione had filled 3 pages with notes during the deliberation period and was currently reviewing them with the focus of someone who wasn't going to rest until everything was synthesized. Neville was standing looking at the fountain with an expression that had moved past the careful quietness of the morning into something more open. How are you doing? Harry asked him. Neville turned. My parents were Aurors, he said. They were tortured by Death Eaters who were never properly prosecuted. They've been in St. Mungo's for 10 years. He paused. And for the first time, today, I watched someone stand up in front of the Wiesengemot and say that the way things have been isn't necessarily the way they have to stay. He looked at Harry. So I'm all right. Harry nodded. They rode back up through the earth in the telephone box, 3 of them again, slightly less tightly wound than on the way down, and came up into the grey London afternoon, the sounds of traffic and pigeons and an ordinary world that knew nothing about what had just happened underground. Hermione tucked her notepad under her arm and looked at both of them. We need to get back to Hogwarts. Yeah, Harry agreed. Also, she said, with the careful precision of someone who has been building to something, I think we need to talk about the 3rd floor corridor. The one that Dumbledore specifically told everyone not to go near. Harry looked at her. Because Dumbledore specifically told everyone not to go near it, she said, and Dumbledore, we have now established, does not give notices like that without a reason. And given that his reasons tend to involve things being considerably more complicated than they appear, you think there's something there he's protecting, Harry said. I think there's something there, Hermione said, that somebody is protecting, and I think it might be worth knowing what. Neville looked between them. Are we doing that? Is that the thing we're doing now? Harry looked at the ministry entrance. He looked at the sky. He thought about Dumbledore's voice in the chamber, I chose the living over the administrative, and about the careful way he'd mentioned the intelligence network, the safe houses, the funds. The man still had a plan. He'd lost a title and gained supervision and given up 400,000 galleons, and he still had a plan, and the 3rd floor corridor was part of it. Yes, Harry said. That's the thing we're doing. They flagged down a cab and went back to King's Cross, and all the way to the station Harry turned the morning over in his mind, the verdict, McGonagall's face, Ragnar's quiet efficiency, the look on Dumbledore's face when Harry had walked past him on the floor, and tried to find the feeling he'd expected to have at the end of it. He'd expected relief. He'd expected satisfaction, the particular satisfaction of a thing concluded. Instead there was something else. Something that felt less like an ending than a shift, like a gear engaging, like a board being cleared and reset. The trial was over. The game was not. He sat on the Hogwarts Express back to Hogsmeade and watched Britain slide past in the October dark, and Hedwig sat on his lap and regarded the window with her customary disdain, and he put his hand on the warm chest of his parents' letters in his bag and thought, I'm coming to understand what you left me. Give me a little more time. Chapter 4, The Fallout. The morning after the trial, Hogwarts woke up different. Not visibly, the castle looked exactly the same, the breakfast was the same, the owls came through the great hall windows with the same coordinated chaos they always did. But the quality of attention in the room had changed. Harry noticed it the moment he walked through the doors, and every table shifted slightly, a subtle collective reorientation, the way a field of sunflowers doesn't turn all at once but each one moves individually toward the same thing. He got a plate of eggs and sat down and ignored it. What he couldn't ignore were the newspapers. The Daily Prophet had the trial on the front page, which he'd expected. What he hadn't entirely anticipated was the headline, which read, "Boy who lived takes Dumbledore to court, Chief Warlock stripped of title in shock goblin verdict." Beneath it, a photograph of the Wizengamot chamber taken by someone in the gallery, showing Harry at the witness position, small against the backdrop of stone walls and tiered benches, looking up at Amelia Bones with an expression that the photographer had somehow caught at exactly the wrong moment, not the composed, clear-eyed version Harry thought he'd presented, but something younger and fiercer, like a match that had just been struck. He read the article. It was mostly accurate, which surprised him. The journalist, a woman named Doris Crockford, apparently a court reporter rather than the usual sensationalist, had covered the evidence methodically and Dumbledore's defense fairly, and Harry's testimony was quoted in full. The framing was neutral enough that you could read it either way, depending on what you already thought. The Prophet had also run a second piece on the same page, a column rather than a report, by someone named Rita Skeeter, which was not neutral at all. The headline was "Who is pulling Harry Potter's strings?" And the argument, such as it was, held that an 11-year-old could not possibly have orchestrated a Wizengamot hearing and that the real question was which shadowy adult interests were using the boy who lived as a weapon against the greatest wizard of the age. Harry read that one, set the paper down, and had some toast. "She says you're a puppet," Ron said, appearing at his elbow and reading over his shoulder with the slightly breathless energy of someone who had been up since 6 processing the news. "That's rubbish." Obviously, Harry agreed. "My mum sent an owl." Ron produced a letter that had been enthusiastically folded. "She wants me to tell you that she thinks it was very brave and also that you should eat properly." Harry looked up at Ron with genuine warmth. "Tell her thank you." Hermione arrived next, already carrying 2 different newspapers and a piece of toast she'd clearly picked up on the way through the hall without stopping. She dropped into the seat across from Harry, unfolded both papers simultaneously, and said without preamble, "Skeeter is going to be a problem." "Probably," Harry said. "She's already suggested you're being manipulated. The next piece will probably suggest you're being manipulated by goblins for anti-ministry reasons. Then she'll move on to something personal." Hermione looked up. "She's going to try to find something about your life at the Dursleys and use it to make you look either pitiable or unstable." Harry thought about this. "Let her." Hermione blinked. "Let her. If she writes about the cupboard, the response to, 'The boy who saved the wizarding world was kept in a cupboard' isn't going to reflect badly on me," Harry said. "Let her try." Hermione opened her mouth, closed it, and went back to the newspaper with the expression of someone who has been outpaced and is recalculating. Neville arrived last, quiet as usual, and sat down and helped himself to porridge without comment. Then he said, "Gran wrote. Good letter or complicated letter?" Harry asked. "Both," Neville said. "She says you have nerve." He paused. "From Gran, that's a high compliment. I'll take it." The day's classes had a different texture than usual, not because anything was said, but because of what wasn't said. Flitwick was brisk and professional and his eyes stayed on the work. Snape was precisely as unpleasant as he always was, which was, in its own way, a kind of consistency Harry found oddly stabilizing. McGonagall taught Transfiguration with the focused attention of someone who was giving the subject everything it deserved, and at the end of the lesson, as students were filing out, she said, "Potter, Granger, your practical work this week has been exemplary. I expect it will continue," which was not about the trial at all, which was exactly the point. It was during lunch that Draco Malfoy came to find him. Harry had been vaguely aware of Draco since the sorting, aware in the way you're aware of whether you haven't had to deal with yet, because it hasn't moved in your direction. He had the smooth, practiced quality of someone who'd been raised to believe that presentation was substance, and he moved through Hogwarts with the particular confidence of a boy whose father had made substantial donations to the school. He had 2 large companions who appeared to be primarily decorative and a sharp, observant face that didn't quite match the performance around it. He appeared at the end of the Gryffindor table with his 2 companions and looked at Harry with an expression that was trying to be casual and wasn't quite achieving it. Potter, he said. Harry looked up from his lunch. Malfoy. This apparently wasn't the reception Draco had prepared for, because he recalibrated slightly. My father sends his regards, he said. He followed the trial proceedings with great interest. Harry waited. He thinks you conducted yourself admirably, Draco said, and the careful neutrality of the phrasing was precise enough that Harry understood immediately. Lucius Malfoy had scripted this opening. This was not a schoolboy conversation. This was an 11-year-old being used as a delivery mechanism for a message from someone who wanted to make contact without making contact. Tell your father thank you, Harry said, in the same tone. And tell him that I'm always happy to hear from people who find legal proceedings interesting, but that I conduct my own business and make my own decisions. Draco's expression moved quickly through several small adjustments. Of course, he said. He'd expect nothing less. Good, Harry said, and went back to his lunch. Draco stood there for a moment, not having been dismissed exactly but not having been given an opening either, and then he left with his companions in tow. Harry watched him go without appearing to watch him go, and beside him Hermione had been very still throughout the exchange. Lucius Malfoy, she said, very quietly. He was a Death Eater, she said. Or everyone thinks he was, he claimed imperious at the trials. He's on the Wiesengemot. He's one of the 12 who voted against the verdict, Harry said. He'd memorized the voting record from the official document Ragnarok had sent that morning. He's also one of the biggest private donors to the ministry and to Hogwarts. So why is he sending his regards? Because Dumbledore is weakened, Harry said, and in the wizarding world, when the most powerful figure weakens, everyone who's been waiting for an opening starts looking at their options. He picked up his fork. Lucius Malfoy has been managing his interests very carefully since the war ended. Dumbledore was a constraint on what he could do. If that constraint is reduced, he sees room to move, Hermione finished. She looked troubled. That's not actually good for us. No, Harry agreed. Which is why I just told his son to tell him I'm not available as a tool. She looked at him for a moment. He's not going to take that as a final answer. I know, Harry said. But it's the right opening move. The real disruption came that evening. Harry was in the library, which had become his default after-dinner location, not because the common room wasn't comfortable, but because the library was quieter and the librarian, Madame Pants, operated on the principle that all students were potential book thieves and therefore treated everyone with such uniform suspicion that it was actually quite peaceful. Nobody bothered you in Madame Pants's library, because she might bother them. He was reading through the supplementary material on the wolfsbane potion, following an interesting thread about the pharmacological interactions between magical and non-magical potion components, when someone sat down across from him. He looked up. Professor McGonagall, which was unexpected in the library at 7 in the evening, and her face was doing the complicated thing it had been doing at the ministry. I need to tell you something, she said. She kept her voice low, though the nearest other students were 3 rows away. It is not, I am not sure it is my place to tell you, and I've been debating it since yesterday. But I've concluded that you have a right to know. Harry closed his book. He waited. You are aware, she said carefully, that last year, Gringotts was broken into. The break-in was reported publicly as an attempted theft from Vault 713. Harry had read about it. Yes. What was not reported publicly, she said, is that Vault 713 was emptied on the same day as the break-in. By Hagrid, on Dumbledore's instructions. Whatever was in that vault was brought to Hogwarts. She held his gaze. It is currently on the 3rd floor. In the corridor. Harry absorbed this. What is it? I don't know entirely, she said. I know it required significant protections. I know that several professors were asked to contribute a protective enchantment each. I was one of them. She paused. I agreed because Dumbledore asked me to, because I trusted him, and because he told me it was a matter of considerable importance to wizarding safety. I did not ask what it was. Another pause, heavier. I am telling you this now because after yesterday I believe you have earned the right to make your own assessments of what concerns you, rather than having them made for you. Harry sat very still for a moment. Then, the break-in was July the 31st. Yes. My birthday, Harry said. The day Hagrid came to get me. The day the audit was triggered. McGonagall's expression confirmed what she wouldn't say directly. Dumbledore moved it to Hogwarts on the same day the audit found it. No, wait. Harry thought through the timeline. The break-in was after Hagrid took me to Diagon Alley. Gringotts sent me the audit letter in the morning, Hagrid arrived, they went to Gringotts, and then someone tried to break in that same afternoon. He looked at McGonagall. So Dumbledore knew someone was targeting it. He moved it before the break-in attempt, not in response to it. Yes, McGonagall said. He's been expecting someone to come for it. She said nothing. Harry thought about the third-floor corridor. About the very specific, very public announcement that nobody should go there. About the kind of man who might make a very public announcement discouraging people from a specific place. He put something valuable on the third floor, Harry said slowly, told the whole school it was there, not what it was, but that there was something dangerous and forbidden, and then installed protections. He stopped. It's bait, he said. McGonagall's expression shifted by a fraction. He's using the school as a trap, Harry said. He moved whatever it is here because he knew someone would come looking for it. He wanted them to come looking in a controlled environment. He looked at her. Who's the someone? McGonagall stood up. I've told you what I know, she said quietly. I've told you more than I perhaps should have, and I've done it because I think you need to be careful. Not of Dumbledore, I believe his intentions are protective. But because, she stopped, gathering something. Because the same logic that led him to manage your estate without your knowledge leads him to use Hogwarts as a strategic asset without fully informing the people inside it. Including the students. She left. Harry sat at the table with his hands flat on the closed book and thought for a long time. Then he went to find Hermione and Neville. They were in the common room, Hermione reading, Neville playing Exploding Snap with Ron in a distracted way that suggested his mind was elsewhere. Harry dropped into the chair between them and kept his voice low, because the common room was busy and he'd learned that the best way to be unheard was to look like you were discussing homework. The third-floor corridor, he said. It's connected to a Gringotts vault break-in last July. Something was moved from the vault to the castle. Dumbledore's using it as a trap. Hermione's book lowered by about 3 inches. A trap for what? I don't know yet. But someone is going to try to get to whatever it is, and Dumbledore is trying to catch them when they do. He looked at both of them. We need to find out what it is. Without going in the corridor, Hermione said, which was phrased as a statement but landed as a question. Without going in the corridor, Harry agreed. At least not until we know what we're dealing with. Ron had lowered his Exploding Snap cards and was looking at Harry with an expression that was rapidly moving from confused to invested. Sorry, he said, what trap? What's in the corridor? We don't know yet, Harry said. But we're going to find out. Yes. Ron looked at his cards, looked back at Harry, and set them on the table with the resolution of someone who has made a decision. Right. I'm in. Obviously. Harry looked at him, this large, easy, generous boy who'd been including himself in things since the train, and felt the particular warmth of someone who has never had a team before and is beginning to understand what one feels like. Yeah, he said. Obviously. The next morning brought a second owl from Ragnarok. Not the small grey professional owl but a large Gringotts official bird, mottled brown and white, which landed on the table at breakfast and deposited 2 letters simultaneously, one addressed to Harry, one addressed to Neville, both sealed with the gold and black crest. Neville stared at his letter the way you stare at something you've been waiting for long enough that its arrival doesn't feel real. Go on, Harry said. Neville opened it. He read it once, quickly, then again slowly. His face moved through several expressions that Harry didn't try to catalogue because they were private. Then he said, quietly, "There are accounting irregularities in the Longbottom estate records going back 8 years. Harry opened his own letter, which was briefer. Ragnar's note confirmed that the preliminary Longbottom inquiry had found significant management discrepancies, not identical to the Potter situation, but rhyming with it. The Longbottom estate's legal management firm had been extracting fees at several times the documented rate, had been leasing 2 Longbottom properties in Yorkshire without the knowledge of Neville's grandmother, and had additionally been holding a power of attorney over certain Longbottom investments that had apparently not been disclosed to Augusta Longbottom when she assumed management of the estate after Frank and Alice Longbottom were incapacitated. "Does your grandmother know?" Harry asked. "I don't think so," Neville said. He looked slightly stunned, which was understandable. She's always handled the estate herself, she thought. Or at least with the firm. "The firm is the problem," Harry said. Neville folded the letter carefully. "I need to write to Gran. Do you want help?" Hermione asked, and the question was so directly practical and caring that Neville looked at her with an expression that was almost surprised, like he'd forgotten that help was something you could ask for. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I would." Harry looked down at Ragnar's letter. At the bottom, in a different ink, as if added as an afterthought, one additional item. "The question of the Potter magical guardianship has been raised in discussion with the Ministry. Several parties have expressed interest. One party of particular relevance has been requesting a hearing from Gringotts since 1981, without success. We will discuss this further at your convenience." He read that line 3 times. Requesting a hearing since 1981. Someone who had been trying to reach Gringotts about the Potter estate since before Harry could walk, and had been blocked for 10 years. He thought about the trial. About the moment Amelia Bones had said the magical guardianship was formally transferred to Gringotts pending the identification of a suitable guardian. About the Wisingamott's records, which he'd studied, and one particular name in the documentation around his parents' deaths, a name that appeared in the Order of the Phoenix records and then disappeared abruptly in November 1981, from all public records, as completely as if it had been surgically removed. Sirius Black. He knew the name. He'd found it in the records Ragnar had provided as background context for the Potter estate, his father's best friend, named as Harry's godfather in James Potter's will, which had apparently never been formally probated. He knew where Sirius Black currently was. He knew what Sirius Black had supposedly done, betrayed the Potters to Voldemort, killed a street full of people, blown up the street laughing. What he had not found, in all his research over 6 weeks, was any record of a trial. Not a conviction. Not a verdict. Not a hearing date. Nothing. Sirius Black had been sent to Azkaban without a trial. Harry sat very still with the letter in his hands. Hermione looked at him. "What?" He handed her the letter, pointing to the last paragraph. She read it. Her eyes sharpened. "Who has been requesting a hearing since 1981? "I think," Harry said, "it's my godfather." Silence at their section of the Gryffindor table. Even Ron had gone quiet. "Sirius Black," Hermione said slowly, the way she said anything she was already assembling from pieces. He's in Azkaban. For betraying your parents." "Yes." "He was convicted by the Wisingamot?" Harry looked at her. He let the silence be the answer. Hermione's expression went through the same journey his had, just faster because she was faster. "He wasn't convicted," she said. "He never had a trial." "I can't find one," Harry said. "I've looked through everything Ragnar sent. I've cross-referenced with the Ministry's public records the library has. There is no trial record for Sirius Black." That's not possible," Ron said. "You can't just, can you? Can they actually do that?" "Apparently," Harry said. "Who put him there?" Neville asked. And that was the question. Harry had been turning it over since the night before, since he'd first started pulling the thread. Technically, aurors could hold suspects pending trial. The minister could authorize extended detention in cases of significant danger to public safety. And in the chaos of November 1981, with Voldemort just fallen and Death Eaters being rounded up and half the ministry either compromised or in shock, it was theoretically possible that someone had put Sirius Black in Azkaban and the paperwork had simply never caught up. Theoretically possible. Or someone had made a decision. The same way someone had made a decision about the Potter estate. A decision that the usual procedures weren't necessary, that the situation was too urgent and too important for administrative niceties, that the greater good required. Harry stopped that thought before it completed itself, because he wasn't ready to look directly at what was at the end of it. Not yet. I'm going to write to Amelia Bones, he said. Hermione looked at him. She just ran a 6-hour hearing. You're going to go back to her already? The hearing established that I have standing as the injured party in matters relating to the Potter estate and the management of Potter guardianship, Harry said. Sirius Black is my named godfather. His detention directly affects my guardianship status. That gives me standing to ask questions. Hermione opened her mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. That's actually a very elegant argument. I got it from the Goblin Accord, Harry said. Articles 14 through 17 cover related party standing. Ron looked at Harry with an expression that suggested he was periodically revising his understanding of what a first year was supposed to be. Did you spend your whole summer reading legal textbooks? And regular ones, Harry said. I also read a lot about potions. Right, Ron said. Obviously. The letter to Amelia Bones was written that evening, in the library, with Hermione reading over his shoulder and making 2 small suggestions about phrasing that he took because they were correct. It was brief. Harry had learned from watching Ragnarok that brevity and specificity carried more weight than elaboration, and it asked a single question: was there a trial record for Sirius Black, and if not, under what legal authority had he been committed to Azkaban? Hedwig took it at 9 that evening with the air of someone who considered nocturnal correspondence entirely reasonable. The response came 2 days later. It was short, and it landed like a stone dropped into very still water. Dear Mr. Potter, I have reviewed the Ministry's records regarding the detention of Sirius Orain Black. I can confirm that no formal trial was held. Mr. Black was committed to Azkaban in November 1981 under emergency detention provisions authorized by the then Minister for Magic, Millicent Bagnold, on the recommendation of the head of the Auror Office. The emergency detention provisions, under the law as it existed in 1981, allowed for detention of up to 1 year pending trial. There is no documentation of any review of Mr. Black's case in the subsequent 10 years. I want to be clear with you, this is deeply irregular. I am initiating a formal review of the detention authorization. I would ask that you treat this information as confidential for the present and direct any further inquiries through this office. Amelia Bones Head, Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Harry read the letter at breakfast, alone. Hermione and Neville were in class already. He'd had a free period, and then folded it with very careful hands and put it in the inner pocket of his robes, close to where his parents' letter sat. 10 years. Sirius Black had been in Azkaban for 10 years, and nobody had scheduled a trial, and nobody had reviewed the detention, and the man who had been his father's best friend and his own godfather had been sitting in a cell surrounded by creatures that fed on happiness for a decade while Harry Potter slept in a cupboard under the stairs. He sat at the table and let himself feel the full weight of it, which he did deliberately because he'd learned that not feeling things didn't make them smaller, it just made them accumulate. Then he picked up his fork and finished his eggs. He was going to need to be sharp for what came next. Quirinus Quirrell had been teaching defense against the dark arts with the air of a man who found defense against everything very stressful, which Harry had initially assumed was simply the personality of someone not particularly suited to their subject. The turban. The stutter. The nervous habit of touching his own head, as if checking something was still there. He'd been keeping an eye on Quirrell since the beginning of term, because the defense teacher who was clearly uncomfortable was always worth watching, and because Dumbledore keeping something dangerous on the third floor and Quirrell being Dumbledore's defense teacher in the same year seemed like too neat a coincidence to be coincidental. What he noticed, when he paid attention, was that the discomfort had a direction. Quirrell was afraid. Genuinely, persistently afraid, not of students, not of the subject, but of something specific and present, and the direction of his anxiety, when Harry tracked it over 3 weeks of careful observation, was consistently oriented toward two things, the third-floor corridor, and Harry himself. He brought this to the others the second week of November. "He flinches when he looks at you," Hermione confirmed, with the certainty of someone who has independently catalogued the same data. "Not all the time. But when you're doing particularly well in class. Or when you're discussing the dark arts theoretically." "He's afraid of what I know," Harry said. "Or afraid of what you might figure out," Neville said. Ron was leaning forward over the table in the library where they'd gathered, his elbows in his homework. "Figure out about what? What is it about him specifically? Is he a Death Eater? Is that what we're saying?" "We're saying," Harry said carefully, "that someone tried to break into Vault 713 on my birthday, which is also the day Dumbledore had Hagrid empty the vault and bring the contents here. Which means someone knew what was in the vault and wanted it. And the only people who knew about the vault contents were people inside Gringotts and the people Dumbledore trusted." Hermione caught the thread immediately. "So either someone at Gringotts told them or someone in Dumbledore's trust did. And the someone in Dumbledore's trust who now has access to Hogwarts Castle, and who is inexplicably nervous around the third-floor corridor," Harry said, "is Quirrell." Silence. "That's circumstantial," Hermione said. "Completely," Harry agreed. "But it fits. Almost too neatly," Harry said. "Which is either because it's correct or because someone wants us to think Quirrell." Ron looked impressed by this in a slightly horrified way. "How do you know when to trust the neat answer? When the alternative explanation requires more coincidences than the simple one," Hermione said automatically, then looked mildly surprised at herself. "So what do we do?" Neville asked. Harry thought about the trap. About Dumbledore's logic, put the thing somewhere accessible, wait for someone to try to take it, catch them in the act. It was, in its brutal way, sound strategy. The problem was that the trap also had to close on something. And the something was presumably dangerous enough that Dumbledore had wanted 6 professors' worth of protective enchantments between it and the rest of the castle. "We keep watching," Harry said. "We find out what it is. And we don't go near that corridor without knowing what we're walking into." He looked at each of them in turn. "We're not doing anything reckless." "Thank you," Hermione said, with feeling. "Not because I'm afraid of it," Harry clarified. "Because going in blind is tactically stupid." "Same outcome," Hermione said. "Different reasoning," Harry said, and she gave him the look she gave him when she was deciding whether to argue and choosing not to. That night, Harry lay in his bed in the dormitory with the curtains drawn and both of Amelia Bones's letters out, side by side, reading them by wandlight. The trial. Sirius. The corridor. Quirrell. Lucius Malfoy's opening move. McGonagall's crisis of faith. Neville's estate. 450,000 galleons slowly making their way back to Vault 687 in installments that Ragnarok updated him on weekly with the precision of a man who found satisfaction in the restoration of correct balances. It was a lot for November, he thought. He thought about what Dumbledore had said in the office on that first evening. "I chose the living over the administrative." And he thought about how that logic, repeated enough times, across enough decisions, could hollow out a man's instinct for the difference between protecting people and managing them. He wasn't going to be that. He was very sure of that. He was going to make choices that could be questioned, interrogated, held to account, because you couldn't demand accountability from others unless you were prepared to be accountable yourself. The photograph of his parents was on his bedside table. The moving image, his father's arm around his mother's shoulders, their laughter looping endlessly at something Harry would never quite see. He folded Bones's letters, put them away, and leaned over to look at the photograph in the dim wand-light. "I'm working on it," he said quietly. "Serious, I mean. I'm working on it." The photograph looped. His mother covered her mouth when she laughed. "I know," Harry said. "I know." He put out the light.